Well, this week I was walking to meet a friend for coffee. It was Wednesday about 11:45, and there was a really beautiful, soft snow that was falling on the ground. And the air temp wasn't that cold, but as I walked, I didn't think it was that cold, but as I walked, I realized I was actually getting a lot colder than I thought I would be. I didn't have proper layers on. I had my hands in my pockets and a backpack on. I tried to pop my collar and kind of hold my neck like this. And as I was walking over to Hy-Vee, I realized how heavy the snow was actually falling and how cold I was actually getting. And so I paused and took a picture. This is a photo of me walking to Hy-Vee that day. No, that's not an actual photo, but I don't know who created that, but props where props are due. It was on the interweb. So I walked over to Hy-Vee, and there I was, continuing on my journey. And again, I don't know if you've recognized, but in Carroll, we don't really have a great sidewalk system between here and there. So if you walk down like 7th Street and you go all the way down, that'd be the smart way to do it. So I was going down 7th Street, and then I hit a patch of ice that apparently hadn't been cleared underneath the freshly fallen snow. And in my non-Iowa winter approved Vans sneakers, I slipped and almost went down. And I caught myself, and there was a lady driving by, and she kind of chuckled, and I kind of chuckled, because we both knew what was going on. And I continued on my way, and I'm like, man, I'm not on no ice, So I'm going down 7th, and then I was like, I'm just going to cut back up to the highway, because maybe if I walk through the parking lots, it'll be a little better plowed, right? So I'm walking through the parking lots, and I'm somewhere down this way, and by Godfathers or something, and I'm walking, now I'm a little cocky, and I'm too heavy-footed, and I hit this patch of ice. My hands are in my pockets. I couldn't get them out in time. My grandfather would have said I went down like a herd of turtles, and it was not pretty. And I sliced open the elbow of my favorite jacket. I was super, super mad, and let's just say I hope there were no cameras doing a close-up on my face, because you wouldn't want to read my lips. And so I got up, I made my way to Hy-Vee, and whatever, everything was fine. But later that night, I decided I wanted to go out and get some fresh air again. And I needed to get over to the rec center. So it's like 4:45, and I'm like, maybe if I'll just walk over to the rec, I'll sign my son up for soccer, I'll get some more fresh air, the sun's coming down. I love walking, right? You probably see me walking all over town. So I'm going for a walk, and I'm going down Grant Street on the football stadium side, and I realize that nobody had walked where I was walking before. Since the snow started to fall, there were no prints in the snow. And so not knowing what was underneath that snow, and having seen that nobody else had walked that way yet since it began to fall, and having fallen earlier, I was walking with extreme caution, right? So now I'm walking down Grant Street, but I'm kind of like dragging my toes, like a forward moonwalk, And I'm going down Grant Street, and I'm dragging my toes, and even so, I hit this patch where I slipped. I didn't go down, but I slipped, and I caught myself, and then I proceeded the rest of the way with even more extreme caution. Anyway, on my way back then, after I left the wreck, and I'm on my way back home, I started recognizing that there were some big boot prints in the snow right beside mine, going the same way I had gone. And this dude seemed like there was like this little Vans print, relatively big Vans print in the snow, and then now there was a little bit of fresh snow on top of that, but then there were these like really current boot prints right beside mine. Must have been a person about my size, same stride, because we were pretty well matching up step for step. And I started thinking, what's going to happen when I get to that place where I almost went down? Like, let's see what became of this person, right? So I'm getting really, really excited. And I'm tracking this guy now, and I'm watching his every step, and I get to the place where my 1 foot slip was, and he had like a 5 foot slip with a twist at the end, and I laughed out loud, because I'm like, that must have seriously been a moment, right? But it struck me, with my prince right there in the snow, had he any sense of awareness? Sorry if you're here today. It just occurred to me, maybe you're here. Well, take this like a man. Looking at my prints in the snow, had this guy had any sense of awareness, had he been looking at my tracks, had he had any sense of awareness, he would have seen my prints and known what was to come. This is how I see the disciples in the New Testament. These first followers of Jesus. Remember, the Bible is a terribly human book. And it doesn't work to sugarcoat these disciples or to paint them in a favorable light. In fact, many of the stories that are told there in the Bible are about what not to do. I came across this poster some years ago, and I've shared it with you before, but I've got to share it again. When I think about the disciples and I see their foibles and their slips in the snow, if you will, I think about this satirical poster that looks like something that might be hanging in your office. Mistakes. It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others. You ever feel like that? I think sometimes that's what the disciples are like in the scriptures. But that's not all that we get from them, right? It's not just the ways that they mess it up. The purpose of the disciples was not only to show us what not to do, but to show us what God in Christ can do. How he can work in and through even us when we are walking in this world with him. And so as we read the stories of the New Testament and we look at the footprints of those first disciples, this is maybe a cute way to say this, that we have an opportunity for breakthroughs because of their breakdowns. We have an opportunity, spiritually speaking, for breakthrough because of the ways that their faith broke down in key moments in the narrative. This week I saw a social media post making the rounds that was explaining the origin of popular sayings. So, all kinds of euphemisms that we just throw out, and it kind of gave the historic background for them. Well, it reminded me of one that my mom used to use as a threat, probably more often than she should have had to, when I was a kid, when she would look at us and say, "If you don't quit that, I'm going to have your head on a silver platter." Anybody ever heard that one before? That's from the Bible. That's from the Bible, and it's actually the background of our text today. The background is that John the Baptist, a relative of Jesus, had literally been arrested and killed, and literally his head was delivered on a platter during a party. If you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 14, we're going to look at a couple of the most well-known miracle stories in the life of Jesus today, and they'll also be up here on the screen if you'd like to just read along, or you can also check them out on your phone if you have an app or whatever. So, Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 12. This is what we read. John's disciples came and took his body. This is after he had been killed. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." And then Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We only have here 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves and then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So, Jesus' relative has been killed, and he's trying to get away. So he literally gets in a boat. Have you ever been at a place in your life where you needed to, metaphorically speaking, get in a boat to get far enough away to get the rest that you need? Jesus gets in a boat, he takes off, he's trying to be alone, but the crowd's already heard about it, and so they must have gone around and walked the rim of the lake, and they get there from the towns and the villages, so that when he lands, there's this crowd that's there, and every one of them has something very important, desperate even, that they need Jesus to do. And what does the text tell us in verse 14? It says, Jesus had compassion on them. My favorite definition of the word compassion, letting your heart walk around in someone else's body. Compassion, from Latin, means to suffer with. Jesus sees the suffering of the crowds, it becomes his own suffering, and he knows he has to do something. And so he is tired, he's grieving. We can imagine. He got in a boat to be alone, and now there's a crowd in front of him, and what's his heart? His heart is compassion. And then evening approaches, and it's getting close to dinner time. Have you ever had guests over for lunch, and then you realize, like, well, it's been fun playing board games, but now it's close to dinner, and you kind of have like a decision to make? So maybe you and your significant other like powwow in the kitchen, and you're like, what exactly are we going to do now? Because 12 was cool, and 2 was cool, and 4:30 was cool, but now it's like 6 o'clock, and everyone's going to get hungry for dinner, and I'm not sure what we have. Do we have food? Are these guys going to be okay with the meatless hamburger helper we were about to eat on the couch? Like we had the like arugula salad with lunch, but now it's meatless hamburger helper, and it's 6 o'clock. And we were going to feed our kids the mac and cheese with hot dog discs, right? Like, is that going to work for this group too? Or can I afford to feed this bunch with all of next week's groceries we just bought? The disciples come to Jesus and they have a problem. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. But Jesus sees potential where they only see a problem. They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And the disciples respond like every one of us would. We only have the box of hamburger helper, Jesus. Like we don't have, plus 3 more families showed up since we started this shindig. They only had food for the 13 of them, the 12 disciples and Jesus, to have a bite or two. And look at the crowd, 5,000 men, not including the women and the children. We might be looking at 10,000 people here. Have you ever been to Hilton Coliseum for an Iowa State basketball game? The scene is comical, right? 10,000 people, most likely. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus. Bring them here to me, Jesus said. Bring them to me. The problem was obvious, wasn't it? And yet Jesus knew exactly what he was capable of in that moment. They didn't know, but Jesus knew. Jesus had no doubt. And so taking the fish and the loaves, he looks up to heaven. It reminds me of that moment when Jesus raised his dead friend Lazarus. Remember? He'd been dead 4 days. Jesus heard he was sick and dying, and so he took his sweet time and made sure he was dead. And that didn't make his friends, the dude's sisters, very happy. Remember this story? And then Jesus finally gets there, and everyone in the ancient world was like, if you're dead 4 days, your spirit can't come back to your body. There's no coming back. And so Jesus intentionally waits 4 days to make sure everyone knew he was not just physically dead, but clinically and spiritually even. There's no coming back from this. And then he doesn't just raise Lazarus from the dead. He goes off where people can still see him and hear him, and he prays. And essentially he prays and he goes, Father, I know what you're going to do, and you know what you're going to do. But I'm praying to you so that all these people would know that it was you that did it. Right? And then he raises him from the dead. It wasn't about Lazarus. It was about the people recognizing the power of God. And so Jesus makes sure they know where that power is coming from. And here, what does Jesus do? Bring me the fish. Guys, like that's what I would have been like if I were Jesus. Bring me the fish. They bring him the stuff. Maybe your Jesus isn't as sarcastic as mine. I think maybe that's how he loves me, right? I can see all the sarcasm. So he gets the stuff. He looks to heaven. Like, God isn't actually up there, right? So what's he do? What's he doing? Right? I mean, God is there, but God isn't physically up. Jesus is looking to heaven. He's proving this is the power of the Father. This is God. And he takes the stuff. I totally lost my place. He takes the fish and the loaves, and he prays, and he breaks them. And then what does he do? He gives them to the disciples to hand out. See, I'm convinced that this isn't so much about feeding people. It's about teaching his disciples what he's capable of when they take what little they have and put it in his hands. It's about the power of God. He's teaching them what it looks like to follow him. And the people on the hill benefited from the meal, sure, but the disciples learned that they, though their resources were so dramatically limited, that they could bring what they did have in their hands to God, and that he would do far more with it than what they could ever have done in their own power. There's another entire sermon right here. If I can take an aside for just a minute, and then I promise we'll come back. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. Think about the disciples and the transformation taking place in them as they handed out that food. When Jesus first prays and breaks it, hands it to you, right? When he first prayed and looked up to heaven and broke it and then gave it to the disciples and said, okay, go hand this out to the crowd. What exactly was going on in their heads? I bet they started out thinking when this runs out, I'm going to look like a huge idiot. And then maybe after the first few hundred people, they were like, how far is this actually going to stretch? I keep handing out hunks of bread and then there's another piece on the loaf. Doesn't tell us exactly how he multiplied it. So what was it like as they continued to hand out the baskets and they're looking at a Colosseum's worth of people in front of them? And then as they continued to hand it out, the fish here and a loaf there, I bet they were like, holy cow, how in the world is this happening? And then finally, looking at an entire mountainside of men, women, and children eating and resting with full bellies and 12 basketfuls of leftovers to take home and doggy baskets, that they started thinking to themselves, this Jesus is some combination of compassion and power that I've never seen. And I cannot imagine anything more worthwhile to do with my life than to follow him with it. I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen anything like that. We have opportunities for breakthroughs in our own journey because of the breakdowns that they experienced. We only have five loaves and 2 fish, Jesus. Bring them to me. He multiplies them and he says, you go hand them out and give these people something to eat. And we benefit from their lesson. The story continues, though. The story continues in another most famous of Jesus' not parables, but miracle stories, verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. And when he dismissed the crowd, and after that, he dismissed them, and he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray, and later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Again, is that story about Jesus showing what he can do, or is it about him inspiring faith in the faithless? What's the end result of the miracle? It's that they worship him and they put their trust in him. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to the surrounding country, and people brought all their sick to him, and they begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. So the meal is over. And it says, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. And then he comes to catch up to the disciples. Sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. is what the text is literally telling us. And he decides to keep surprising them. Now, again, let's just put ourselves in the situation here. Think about this. These poor disciples have been up all night long hosting this unexpected dinner party for a stadium-sized crowd. Have you ever had an unexpected guest or two show up at your house? How about a stadium worth of guests? They've been up all night long with this crowd. And then Jesus makes them get into the boat and set off while he sees the guests out, so to speak. And the way he gets back to them, which all seems very premeditated, doesn't it? When you read these stories in sequence, the way he chooses to get back to them is to walk on choppy water through pre-dawn darkness, and when they see him, they're rightfully about to lose it. It's a ghost! You would think the same thing. They cried out in fear, and Jesus calls Peter to come to him. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." So let me get this straight. Peter is literally walking on water, called by Jesus, the one who just fed a multitude, which made no sense, and now Peter has taken steps on the water, which defies all logic. He's taken steps on the water when he sees the wind and is filled with fear. Doesn't that sound a little ridiculous? You just saw what Jesus did with the multitude. Now you're literally standing on a wave, and you see some wind, and you're struck with fear. I mean, given the circumstances, shouldn't he be pretty confident at this point? But Peter is a fisherman. Peter makes his money on the water. Peter has spent lots of days out on these waters. He's spent lots of hours in a boat. Peter knows that his safety is dependent on watching for changes in the weather. And so here is Peter walking on the water with Jesus, and yet his instinct to fear the wind is greater than his instinct to trust in the call of Jesus. You and I have opportunity for breakthrough because of their breakdown, and I wonder if God is speaking a word to you today through these stories as you walk in the footsteps of these disciples. Maybe you have slipped where they've slipped. You were in a situation and you only saw a problem, but Jesus seemed to see potential. And like the disciples with only 2 fish and 5 loaves, you knew you didn't have what it took to accomplish the thing he asked you to do. And everybody around you seemed pretty excited to tell you you didn't have what it took to accomplish what you thought God was asking you to do too. In fact, they pointed that out freely. You didn't even have to ask them to point it out to you. And they were like, "What, are you crazy? You can't do that." And to add insult to injury, they weren't wrong. You didn't have what it took to get it done. You did not have what it took, but thank God he had the power to do it in you. The Apostle Paul has a word in his second letter to the church at Corinth where he writes these words. He writes, "What we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and what we preach." Let me rewind that. What we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let the light shine out of the darkness." Yeah, you remember the one who created all things? Yeah, that's the one we're talking about. He made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we, you and I, have this treasure in jars of clay. Why? To show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Paul is saying what Christians should say every single time. Of course I'm weak, but the one in me is strong. And some of us are guilty, and this is me too, of using a verse like this to justify our failure. Like, yeah, I don't expect very much from myself because I'm just like a jar of clay. Yeah, God's Holy Spirit is with me, but I'm just this weak little vessel, so of course I just mess it up sometimes, right? So we can take a verse like this and use it to justify our failure, but what if we used it to expect great things even from weak vessels like us? Not because we're strong, but because the one in us is almighty. The disciples walked away from feeding that crowd and they still felt weak. I guarantee you they didn't walk away from that crowd and they were like, "Look what we did. Check us out." Woo. A little swagger now. Like, no, dude, they weren't like that. They walked away from that crowd and they still felt weak. Maybe more aware of their limits than they had ever been before. But they had also never been more sure of Jesus' power. And maybe like the disciples before that crowd, you're aware of your weakness, and it's time to come to him relying on his strength. Or maybe you have stepped out faithfully into what God has called you to do, and you've seen success. In fact, the success you saw defied all logic, and you couldn't even believe with your eyes what was happening. But like Peter, you've trained your eyes, and your instinct to fear potential threat is greater than your instinct to trust in the one who called you to get out of the boat. My prayer for us today is that we pay attention to where these older brothers in the faith have walked, and find a clear pathway for our steps. To see where it is that they've walked, to look at those prints, so to speak, see where they've walked and find a clear pathway for our own steps. May we bring what we do have to Jesus and see our faith transformed as he multiplies what we bring him, and see his work of compassion and power impact our community and our world. And may we be people who thank God for the life-saving instincts He's given us, but learn to trust even more deeply in His call than in the scary things happening around us. May their steps guide our steps, showing us the way to follow Jesus and reminding us that there is grace when we slip and fall, and filling us with a faith that's greater than our fear. I'm going to invite the band to come up to close us in a song, but before I do, in closing, actually the band is invited to come up, but before I close, they're all, oh, I'm sorry. If anyone here is like, I just like a church where everything is produced real slick, this ain't the place. I apologize. I really do. But in closing, I do want to point something out. It struck me as ironic that when reading this chapter from Matthew, we can be captivated by the miraculous elements, right? The feeding of the 5,000, Peter walking on the water. These are the things that went on the flannel graph for those of you in church 30 years ago, right? But if we focus on the miraculous, we miss an incredibly important point, really the backdrop of the entire storyline, which is this. Jesus was trying to be alone. The backdrop of both of these stories is Jesus was trying to be alone. I don't know, I've never heard a sermon from this passage that focused on Jesus trying to be alone. Going back to the start, we see that his relative, John the Baptist, remember, he was the one that baptized Jesus himself. He's been killed. John had called out the family of King Herod for some very bizarre and wicked, incestuous stuff that for the sake of the children, I'm not going to read you. He called it out in the family, and they didn't like that. And our text today was queued up with this. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then went and told Jesus. And when Jesus had heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Jesus was trying to get away. And the irony is that we notice the miraculous stories of his interactions, but those weren't what he was hoping for to begin with. Jesus had to be grieving the death of his cousin and friend, perhaps even a mentor to him, and he was trying to be alone. Now, of course, the crowds, having heard of that, came to him on foot from all the towns. Any moms here know what that's like? When you need to be alone for 5 minutes. And that's the exact moment when, by some miracle of science, you become a magnet for children and dogs who gather right in front of the bathroom door. Can anyone relate to this? I'm not asking you to raise your hand. Is that just my house? I don't know. Jesus is trying to get alone. And remember, after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus sends his disciples away and he dismisses the crowd. And verse 23, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there all alone. For some of you, that's the part of the story that you actually need to hear today. The through line of these stories is Jesus trying to be alone with God to grieve and pray and breathe. And for some of you, these are the footsteps you need to follow. These are the ones that will keep you from slipping. These are the ones that are revealing your next secure step. It's not the heroic or the divine or the miraculous elements of the story, but the most human one. The one where Jesus shows us how to take care of ourselves. Show compassion? Yes. Help the hurting? Of course. Train up people God has given you to lead? 100%. But if we want to be like Jesus, we need to also learn how to get alone with the Father and move into the world refreshed and refocused by Him. Allowing God to move powerfully through us will require nothing less. Can we pray?